Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war news update, US political update, European political update concerning the peace negotiations between the US and Europe, I guess. There's been this meeting in Geneva over the past 24 hours or so where the Americans and the Europeans and the Ukrainians have been convening to renegotiate the peace deal between the US and Russia. Ukraine and Russia, the one that appears to have been created by Kirill Dmitriev and the Kremlin. I get a sense that the Americans have kind of backed down a bit because there's been such a big pushback. But what this probably has done is expedited a peace agreement. Now, some people might, or at least proper negotiations for a peace agreement. Some people might look to Trump and say, well done, Trump, you have actually got things moving here. But by all accounts, it's really Russia that's been instrumental here and not so much the Americans. And we're going to talk about Trump's relationship with this deal in a second. We're going to go first, though, to Bill Kristol, who's looked a little bit at the rumor mill or rumor intelligence. He says it's pretty reliable, but this appears to be what's going on. Before we get there, as ever, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. That really does help the channel out. Thank you for those who have already done so. Now let's go and look in further detail. Okay, so Bill Kristol here says, for what it's worth, Rumint, but it's pretty reliable. It says, 1, J.D. Vance, the vice president, the key to the US is the key to the US embrace of the Russia plan on Ukraine. We know that J.D. Vance is of the Heritage Foundation worldview, where he sees the US in more isolationist terms and is no fan of Ukraine in any way, shape, or form. So he is a key to this US embrace of what Russia has presented. Marco Rubio, on the other hand, and even Trump are out of the loop. And this is what I was saying about Trump not really having a handle of what's going on. This is happening with other people. Yeah, I was saying the other day that Steve Witkoff gave a big thumbs up to Kirill Dmitriev's plan, but I'm not really sure he shared it with Trump certainly not that carefully. Trump's just going to be like, yep, let's get this thing done. He's not a details guy. Trump is not a details guy. Second point here is the Vance-Rubio relations are awful. And that wouldn't surprise me. Rubio is more of an old school Republican in many ways. You can see him die time after time after time during this Trump administration. Last 10 months have been particularly difficult for him, where he's had to sit in public places and listen to Trump and JD Vance go off on one, and then just his soul just leaves his body and evaporates into the ether. So the Vance-Rubio relationship at the moment is particularly awful, says Bill Kristol from his sources. And the third point is Marco Rubio, again, the Secretary of State here, told the senators what they said he told them. So the idea is, let's go back a day or two. The idea that came from the White House press secretary and Rubio himself was that this claim from Senator Rounds and Senator Angus Young that Marco Rubio come to them and said this is not an American plan, this is a Russian plan, etc., was then denied by the White House. So the idea is that these senators were lying, and actually this is truly what's happening, that actually this is a genuine peace plan that the Americans have been involved in, State Department has been involved in it, etc. But Rubio previously told Rounds and Angus Young and others that actually he had not been communicated with in any form concerning this negotiation, this 28-point peace plan. He'd been kept out of the loop. This was a Russian plan. That statement, that claim from Marco Rubio appears to be correct, and it was true that he told those senators that, according to Bill Kristol here. Pete Hegseth, as a fourth point, the present Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, He is paranoid that he'll be shoved out for Driscoll. So Dan Driscoll is this guy, a friend of JD Vance. That might be relevant. They went to college together. He is the guy that was flown out as a military man to Kiev to deliver them this 28-point plan. It could be that he's the one that ends up replacing Pete Hegseth. Pete Hegseth isn't quite serious enough, arguably, for the job that he has. Now, moving on, there's a fascinating Washington Post article out. The US, Ukraine, and Ukraine agreed to change a draft of a peace plan that appeased Russia. Negotiators in Geneva had been working off an earlier proposal that bipartisan lawmakers say would further destabilize global security by rewarding Russia after its 2022 invasion. So the US officials said that Trump hasn't been as involved in the specifics. That's what I was talking about right the front end, is that Donald Trump is not a details guy, and that's what the Washington Post says. Quote, you tell him, I'm going to try to get a deal. He will say, great, go see what you can do. And that's the level of detail he has. It's been an absolute chaos all day. It's embarrassing. And I talked to you yesterday about how I said it was chaos. A European official said it seemed Washington was almost taken by surprise on the whole thing on Friday. Usually when there's more to it, it feels different. Our feeling has been DC has been taken by surprise by Witkoff's actions, the official said. Wow. So this is the section from the article. And as you can see there, a US official who spoke, like others, on the condition of anonymity because of the sensitivity of the matter, said the president hasn't been as involved in the specifics, so on and so forth. So unsurprising, but I think it goes to show that the Russians really were, I think, dictating things here and have succeeded in implanting their ideas right at the forefront of people's thoughts. Okay, Reuters has published another version of the EU peace plan for Ukraine. The number for the armed forces is now thought to be 800,000. Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will be restarted under the supervision of the IAEA. The energy produced will be divided equally between Ukraine and Russia. NATO agrees not to station its troops in Ukraine on a permanent basis in peacetime. Russia will be able to return to the G8. Elections in Ukraine will be held as soon as possible after the signing of the peace agreement. Ukraine will not restore control over the occupied territories by force. Earlier, Rubio stated that he had not seen any European counterplan. So this is another Russian counterplan, although it says another version of the EU peace plan for Ukraine. I was under the impression, it says Europeans propose changes to US Ukraine plan with higher army cap, NATO style security pact, according to a doc. But this strikes me as another kind of Russian approach. It doesn't look that dissimilar from the Russian plan. So I'm not too sure about that. We're going to get on to some leaked points of the European position in a second. But just before we get there, Zelensky says that Geneva talks have been intense and productive with both the US and EU sides engaged. He notes signs that Trump's team is listening and emphasizes Ukraine's priority, a reliable peace, real security, and respect for those who sacrificed. Talks will continue late into the night. And then we have yesterday we had a situation where Andriy Yermak and Marco Rubio came out and gave a little talk. RBC Ukraine says that the talks in Geneva, delegations of Ukraine and the United States managed to agree on most of the plan's norms and correct a significant number of controversial points. Among the agreed and corrected points, the issue of the size of the armed forces of Ukraine, the fate of the ZNPP, the nuclear power plant, the format of the exchange of prisoners, and the return of convicts. Now, I have to say that if they really have capped the Ukrainian armed forces at 800,000, I find that utterly unacceptable. I don't know how you can say that the victim has to cap the size of their armed forces, but the aggressor doesn't. This is absolutely unconscionable to me. The points concerning territories and the consolidation of Ukraine's non-admission to NATO in the constitution have so far been put out of brackets. They will be agreed directly by Zelensky and Trump. The meeting may take place as early as next week. The US, quote, the US military believes that the next months will be critical for us and that in 12 months we will lose the Donetsk region. And if they cut everything off from us, this may happen even faster. Okay, so the threat of Ukraine not doing a peace deal will mean the aid to Ukraine is cut off, and that means Donetsk will be lost even faster than 12 months that the that the Americans at the moment predict. Now, I am going to do a video today, hopefully, looking at a report on what would be lost if Americans, I think it's a CSIS report, if the Americans do stop helping Ukraine. And actually, there is quite a bit to it. So we'll get into that later. But again, I go back to this issue that I find it amazing that the Europeans would actually agree to a capping of the Ukrainian armed forces at all. Okay, it would never be on my list. It's like, why the hell would they cap their armed forces? All that does is helps an aggressor attack them again. Ukraine are not going to attack Russia. Now, I suppose what Russia are worried about is Ukraine attacking to take back the Donbass themselves. But I just find it amazing that the aggressors get to keep their sizable army and demand that the victim reduces theirs. Is just incredible. Anyway, here is Marco Rubio talking.
At the outset, let me say we're going to come back to you here in a few minutes, maybe an hour or 2 hours from now. So I'm not going to take questions now because we're not going to take questions now because we want to come back to you, but we wanted to keep you updated. So it is in my personal view that we've had probably the most productive and meaningful meeting so far in this entire process since we've been involved in from the beginning. We have a very good work product that was already built on a foundation of input from all the relative parties involved here. And we were able to go through some of those items now point by point, and I think we've made good progress. Our teams have now gone to their rooms as we're working on some of the suggestions that were proffered to us. So we're working through making some changes, some adjustments in the hopes of furthering narrowing the differences and getting closer to something that both Ukraine and obviously the United States are very comfortable with. Obviously, this will ultimately have to be signed off by our presidents, although I feel very comfortable about that happening.
I just want to interrupt there because I find it odd that the US has to be comfortable with it. I guess if you're talking about security guarantees, there are certain things that the US will be obliged to do or required or requested to do. So maybe that is fair, but it's this idea that the US isn't just mediating here. The US is negotiating, and it's not negotiating for Ukraine. It's negotiating for its own benefit, it seems.
Given the progress we've made. And then obviously there's the Russian side of the equation. But again, we think we have some pretty substantial insights over the last 9 months into some of the things that are really important to them. So I think the takeaway from it is, I think this was a very, very meaningful, I would say probably best meeting and day we've had so far in this entire process, going back to when we first came into office in January. But there's still some work left to do, and that's what our teams are going to be doing right now. And we'd like to come back to you maybe a little later tonight with further updates.
Dear journalist, dear Marco, and I want to confirm that we have a very productive first session with distinguished American delegation. We have very good progress, and we are moving forward to the just and lasting peace. Ukrainian people deserve and want this peace more than anyone in this planet. We thank our big friends, United States and personal President Trump.
And of course, he's having to do that. It's very pointed that he's doing the thanks because Trump had a right old whinge on Truth Social. And I did a video on that, breaking news video on that yesterday, where he had a go at the Ukrainian leadership, particularly in the context of not being grateful enough. So now the next day, Ukrainians have to come out and say how wonderful Donald Trump is and how amazing they are as leaders and friends, and we thank them, and etc.
And his team to their commitment to bring this peace. And we will continue to work today, as Secretary said. We will be working and in coming days to join proposals, and we will also will engage our European friends. And of course, the final words will be of our leaders, of the President of United States and Ukraine. And I hope that we can achieve the good progress today. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be back to you.
Okay, so we'll leave that there. On Andrei Yermak basically saying that they made very good progress, but there's still needs to be a lot of input from the European side of things. So that was earlier on, I think, in the process. Christopher Miller from the Financial Times says, what I'm hearing from President Zelensky's team is that negotiations have been tough, but they feel they are making actual progress in the talks with the Americans. As for Zelensky going to Washington, so this has been touted, this has been something being considered in the president's office since last week when this new Trump push began. There are two camps. One that thinks Zelensky needs to go to DC to hash it out with Trump in person. Another that fears it could go awry, like past meetings, and lead to a serious setback. Whether Zelensky goes to Washington again will depend on the outcome of talks and if the Ukrainians believe there is something they can sign their name to without selling the country down the river, says Christopher Miller. So we've got Europe's 24-point peace plan, which looks completely different to anything that we've just been discussing. Calls for a ceasefire, third-party monitoring, and talks based on current front lines. It includes full POW swaps, return of civilians, NATO guarantees, no limits on Ukraine's military, and control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and key infrastructure. Russian assets fund Ukraine's recovery there. As War Translated here says, the Telegraph published this. But I just don't know whether this is something they've at all managed to negotiate into actually being. I presume this is their opening gambit wish list, but it's just the complete antithesis, the foil to the Russian 28-point plan. And this is looking as positively at the situation from a pro-Ukrainian point of view. So this is a 24-point European counter proposal in full. I'll read it to you. 1. End of the war and arrangements to ensure no repetition to establish a permanent basis for lasting peace and security. 2. Both parties in the conflict commit to a full unconditional ceasefire in the sky, on the land, and at sea. 3. Both sides immediately enter into negotiations on technical implementation of ceasefire monitoring with the participation of the US and European countries. 4. US-led international ceasefire monitoring by partners of Ukraine is introduced. Monitoring will be predominantly remote using satellites, drones, and other technological tools with a flexible on-land component to investigate alleged violations. 5. A mechanism will be created through which parties can submit reports of ceasefire violations and to investigate ceasefire violations and discuss corrective measures. 6. Russia unconditionally returns all deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children. The process will be supported by international partners. 7. The parties to the conflict exchange all prisoners of war, the principle of all for all. Russia releases all civilian detainees. 8. Upon ensuring sustainability of the ceasefire, the parties to the conflict take measures for humanitarian relief, including family visits across the line of contact. 9. Ukraine's sovereignty is respected and reconfirmed. Ukraine is not forced to be neutral. 10. Ukraine receives robust, legally binding security guarantees, including from the US, Article 5-like agreement, to prevent future aggression. 11. No restriction imposed on Ukraine defense forces and defense industry, including international cooperation. So this is goes against what we're just hearing, that they had agreed that 800,000 cap was the case. Here is no restriction imposed on them. So I presume this was kind of the starting point, and they've had to negotiate some of this away. 12. The guarantor states will be an ad hoc grouping of European countries and willing non-European countries. Ukraine is free to decide on the presence, weapons, and operations of friendly forces invited by the government of Ukraine on its territory. And again, if there's any agreement there that there are no foreign forces, then that's in contravention of where the Europeans initially wanted things to go. 13, Ukraine's membership in NATO depends on consensus within the alliance. I guess that should be just sensible. 14, Ukraine becomes a member of the EU. 15, Ukraine is ready to remain a non-nuclear state under the NPT. 16, territorial issues will be discussed and resolved after a full and unconditional ceasefire. 17, territorial negotiations start from the current line of control. 18, once territorial issues have been agreed upon, both Russia and Ukraine commit not to change these by force. 19, Ukraine regains control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with US involvement, and also the Kakhovka Dam. A mechanism of transfer of control will be established. 20, Ukraine enjoys unhindered passages on the Dnipro River and control of the Kinburn Spit. Now, the Kinburn Spit's important because it's actually not in any of the aforementioned oblasts the aforementioned, the ones we normally talk about, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. Kinburn Spit, although it's kind of appended to the end of, across the river from Ochakiv and down the river from Kherson, and it is appended to Kherson region. It's actually part of Mykolaiv region, which Ochakiv and part the land opposite the Kinburn Spit on that coast on the right bank of the Dnipro River. That's all Mykolaiv Oblast. So it kind of it's close to Kherson. Kherson becomes Mykolaiv, and so Kinburn's part of that. So I guess this is not just to ensure safe passage of ships down the river, and that's a Bug River as well as the Dnipro, but it also means that Mykolaiv stays completely under control of the Ukrainians. 21, Ukraine and its partners implement economic cooperation without restrictions. 22, Ukraine will be fully reconstructed and compensated financially, including through Russian sovereign assets that will remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine. 23, sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014 may be subject to gradual and partial easing after a sustainable peace is achieved, and subject to resumption in the event of a breach of the peace agreement snapback. And 24, separate talks will begin on European security architecture, including all OSCE states. So that's a European position early doors, but that may well have changed drastically during the course of those negotiations. A joint statement after the discussions of the US peace proposal in Geneva, Anton Gerashenko repeats what the White House says here. Both sides agreed the consultations were highly productive. The discussions showed meaningful progress toward aligning positions and identifying clear next steps. They reaffirmed that any future agreement must fully uphold Ukraine's sovereignty and deliver a sustainable and just peace. As a result of the discussions, the parties drafted an updated and refined peace framework. The Ukrainian delegation reaffirmed its gratitude for the steadfast commitment of the United States and personally President Donald J. Trump for their tireless efforts aimed at ending the war and the loss of life. So the White House statement, this joint statement, has the Ukrainians saying how wonderful the Americans are, of course. Ukraine and the United States agreed to continue intensive work on joint proposals in the coming days. They will also remain in close contact with their European partners as the process advances. Final decisions under this framework will be made by the presidents of Ukraine and the United States. Both sides reiterated their readiness to continue working together to secure a peace that ensures Ukraine's security, stability, and reconstruction. And there you go. Now, Zelensky has said, we are at a critical moment now. There is a lot of noise in the media, a lot of political pressure. Quote, we will continue to explain how dangerous it is to pretend that aggression can be ignored as if everything's defeated by itself. And then finally, we have Steve Rosenberg, BBC correspondent in Moscow, looking at the Moscow newspapers. In today's Russian papers, there's skepticism over the current round of diplomacy. One paper says, quote, the European-Ukrainian gang will correct Trump's plan so that it's unacceptable for Russia. In other words, there is this understanding that the previous plan, the kind of Russian Witkoff plan, the Dmitriev-Witkoff plan, which aligns with what Trump wants, or Trump doesn't really care either way, he just wants peace. And if the Europeans get involved to act on behalf of the Ukrainians, it will be unacceptable for Russia. Russia will simply not agree to it. Another newspaper says, I don't think the special military operation will end this year. And the final point to make is that Thursday Thanksgiving deadline, November the 27th, may now be more flexible, according to Marco Rubio himself, saying that they are no longer pressuring Zelensky to sign a peace deal by that point, which is good news because you don't want to force things to happen kind of artificially. And so it's rushed. It would just be at a massive disadvantage to Ukraine. It just really would. There's no pressure for Russia in the same context, is there? So all the pressure is on Zelensky, and it still appears that way. I just think this whole process, if it does end up with a peace deal, and if if Trump gets applauded for getting this peace deal happening, just remember that the way that it is taking place is to the benefit of Russia. Ukraine is being forced towards a Russian POV, a Russian position here, by the way that Kirill Dmitriev presented the plan to Witkoff, and it then gets forced through onto the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians and Europeans are left kind of picking up the pieces and rushing to put together a plan that is using the Russian plan as a benchmark. I just think the whole thing is skewed towards Russia, and I'm pretty sure if something does come about from this, history will look back and say, yeah, Russia were the victors in this kind of process here. They were the ones that managed to manipulate and to get more of what they wanted. But then, it depends if the Ukrainians put back and the Europeans together, try and negotiate back to a position that's much more acceptable to the Ukrainians, you could see very plausibly a situation where the Russians, as the newspapers are kind of hinted at here, where the Russians find those Ukrainian positions unacceptable. If the Russians are intransigent, which they look like they could be, that they feel like they're getting success on a battlefield in the Donbass region, and if the Americans are saying, well, look, the Russians could take Donbass within a year, then you might see the Russians have some kind of wind behind their sails and say, no, we find this unacceptable. Maybe we can come together for another set of peace negotiation talks later, but for the moment we're just going to carry on as we are at the moment. Thank you very much. So who knows? But anyway, that's the latest on what's been going on there. I hope that was of use for you. Gives you a bit of a useful overview as to the machinations taking place in Geneva. Just remember, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, and that will be super useful. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.